In 1945, Britain stood as a military victor of the deadliest war in human history. They had survived the Blitz and held the line for Western civilization. Yet by the time the dust settled, the wealthiest empire on Earth emerged from the conflict completely bankrupt. In December 1940, London was burning under Nazi bombs, but the government was hiding a secret. The British Empire was financially bleeding to death. Winston Churchill and his cabinet understood that without immediate aid, the nation's ability to function was measured in weeks, not years. Churchill sent a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt admitting that Britain, once the world's bank, had run out of cash. The Prime Minister wrote that his people were ready to fight on the beaches, but they no longer had money for bullets. The survival of the country shifted from a military effort to a high-stakes financial negotiation. Britain was now completely dependent on the terms set by its only remaining ally. Early American aid arrived under strictly commercial conditions. Washington operated as a pawnbroker, ensuring that every crate of supplies was backed by British assets. The U.S. Congress enforced a policy called cash and carry. It required Britain to pay for all war materials immediately in gold. Britain also had to transport the goods on its own ships, bearing all the risk of German submarine attacks before the cargo even left American waters. To keep its armies in the field, Britain began liquidating the long-term wealth that had sustained its empire for generations. They were trading their national foundations for the bare necessities of short-term survival. Under the codename Operation Fish, the British government moved its entire national gold reserve across the Atlantic Ocean. They used high-speed warships to shuttle billions in gold bars and securities to vaults in North America, ensuring they had the liquid assets to pay U.S. invoices. By late 1940, the gold had run out. In Washington, British purchasing agents held billions in unsigned contracts for tanks and planes they could no longer afford. The London Treasury was effectively empty. U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau demanded a total audit of the British Empire's assets. He insisted on seeing the value of everything from industrial machinery to the private stock holdings of individual British citizens. This audit placed the British Empire under the equivalent of a corporate receivership. American officials treated their sovereign ally as a failing business, checking the books before authorizing further assistance. To appease isolationist politicians in the U.S., Britain was forced to sell the American Viscose Corporation. This was the largest manufacturer of rayon in the United States and the centerpiece of Britain's American industrial investments. Wall Street banks took advantage of Britain's desperation. They undervalued the company and forced a sale for roughly $54 million, about half of its true value. The proceeds went directly into the U.S. Treasury to cover weapons orders. Through these forced liquidations, the United States absorbed the most profitable sections of the British economy while Britain was distracted by the war in Europe. The sell-off eventually reached the empire's territory. When Britain needed 50 old U.S. destroyers to defend its supply lines from U-boats, Roosevelt saw an opportunity to expand American influence. Roosevelt demanded 99-year leases on British military bases across the Western Hemisphere. In exchange for 50 old ships, the U.S. gained a massive footprint from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. Britain surrendered sovereign control, trading a century of regional dominance just to keep convoys moving. This was a massive geopolitical fire sale. Britain traded its future global influence for the immediate ability to stay in the fight. On VJ Day, while crowds celebrated in London, the U.S. government was already moving on. 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed the order to immediately terminate the Lend-Lease program. American supply ships carrying food and tools to Britain were ordered to turn around mid-ocean and return home. Britain had hollowed out its domestic industry to produce weapons for the common cause. Now they were bankrupt and starving. To keep its citizens fed, the UK was forced to ask for a massive loan, effectively begging for a lifeline. Economist John Maynard Keynes went to Washington to ask for a grant, citing Britain's sacrifices. He was refused. Instead, he had to accept a $3.75 billion commercial loan, with interest and strict conditions. The 1946 loan included a requirement for Britain to make its currency, the pound, freely convertible to U.S. dollars. This policy allowed the U.S. to dismantle the British imperial trade system, forcing Britain's colonies to spend their money on superior American goods instead of British ones. By 1947, Britain faced the coldest winter in its history, with no money to buy coal or food. Citizens lived with harsher rationing than they faced during the war itself. Bread, never rationed during the Blitz, was now limited by the government. This chart shows the value of the pound versus the dollar in 1947. When the currency conversion rule took effect, nations around the world immediately dumped their pounds for dollars. The UK's reserves plummeted, and the government had to admit it could no longer afford to maintain its global military commitments in Greece and Turkey. The financial cost of the war lasted for generations. Every year for 6 decades, the British government sent a payment to the US Treasury. Britain did not finish paying off its World War II survival loans until December 29, 2006. The United States effectively purchased the British Empire through 60 years of interest, audits, and asset liquidations. If you want to understand the economic forces that shape our world, subscribe and let us know what story we should cover next.